Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. In today's episode, which was recorded together in the studio, a rare and happy occurrence when we're able to be together in person, Steve and I discuss the future of the security leader, including the characteristics of security leaders today compared to those likely to be required in the future, as well as the future operating model of the security function. Steve, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today. You and I are always on podcasts and behind the mic, but today we're mixing it up and we're in person for once, so great to be here with you.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
I mean, no promises. That's fair. Today I wanted to discuss with you a topic that I think is of great importance to you and to ISF overall, the future of the security leader. And I want to start with some historical research. 2 years ago, 67% of surveyed CISOs said that they had come into security from a technical background. And I think the future looks quite different. Is that accurate? Is technology, a technical background, no longer going to have that same prevalence, do you think?
I think we're certainly seeing an evolution. That's the way that I'd describe it. I think that's absolutely right. Most of them had come from that technical space. I mean, if you look at a large number of our members, then some of those CISOs will still fit within, the CIO or the CTO's remit. I was talking to one member just the other day who was telling me that one of the biggest changes they'd had to go through in 2022 had been moving from being under the CIO to moving under the CRO, the Chief Risk Officer.
Oh, interesting.
And some of the changes that had brought about. So I think that historically people have come from that technical background. Going forward, where do I think they're going? I think that we're seeing them evolving much more into being more rounded executives, more rounded senior executives. If we think about what that means, it means that there's much more of a requirement for some of the soft skills.
Right, which we've talked about for years.
Exactly. And I think that is presenting challenges for some. You know, you have to be able to, once you have access to the C-suite, to the board, you have to be able to communicate effectively at that level. But you also have to be able to communicate effectively below as well.
Right.
So it's a big change for a number of them who've come from that technical space. So I'm not surprised by the stat, but I do think it is changing. And I think that is what is throwing up some of the challenges for some CISOs as they try to make that transition. Because for a lot of organizations, they're not providing the support, the training to get them there.
I think the point that you made, that it's not just now that future security leaders need to have all new skills to talk up the chain, but they need to continue to be a sort of holistic 360-degree level of communication, talking to everybody. So their jobs are getting, I think, more complicated, maybe more satisfying too, to be maturing and to have more opportunities of people within the business that they're intersecting with. Is that a fair assessment?
I think we're seeing a maturing of the CISO role that reflects a maturing of the industry. So again, if we go back not that far, it was very common in most organizations that had a security department. See that being very siloed.
Right.
Very focused on what they were there to do.
Right.
If I now talk to some of the power CISOs, if I could put it that way, and we've had a few of them on the podcast, I'm thinking of Delta, I'm thinking of DHL, those sorts of organizations. We've seen the CISO move into being much more of a strategic partner for the business and really having, I think, to shoulder a lot of the responsibility that comes with that for communication across the business, but also for alignment with what they're doing with the forward direction that the business is taking.
Right.
Because boards in particular are asking questions about how secure are we? How do we compare with other organizations? Do we have the right level of risk management, of resilience in line with what we're trying to do? You think about perhaps going through an M&A process or continuing to develop operations into a different part of the world. CISOs are starting to get very much more involved in those kinds of discussions, whilst at the same time having to make sure that the patching's been done and that the company is as safe as can be from phishing, and all of those sorts of things.
Right.
So it's a really varied job, I think, and it's one that is continuing to mature. I think if I were to sort of look forward, then my prediction would be that the CISO becomes almost entirely a business executive with very, very small span of control of security departments, because we've moved the security departments out into the business. So security has become so integrated into what the business is doing.
Yeah.
Security by design really has evolved in those forward-looking organizations that they don't need to rely on some of these people. And I think, therefore, we will see some migration back from security into IT. So a clear delineation between what really is IT in terms of the stuff that powers the organization and what security is doing, which is making sure that we have the right processes and guidelines and procedures in place to make sure that what the business is going to deliver using that technology is as resilient as it can be, in line with the direction that the business is headed. So that, for me, is the forward-looking shift.
Well, I've heard security leaders start to use language that I didn't hear in years past. They're talking about EBITDA and margin and real financial language, that business vocabulary. Do you think that while they're talking in these new languages and talking about this new integration into the business, that they can lose some of these jack-of-all-trades sorts of skills where they were troubleshooting and sort of not only doing fire prevention, but firefighting? Are there tasks that are falling off their list, or are they only accumulating ever more responsibility, do you think?
I think that for the very mature CISOs in the very mature organizations, then some of those tasks are falling away. The key is in the word chief. If you want to have chief in your title, then that requires you to step up and do things that are different. If we look at what a chief operating officer does, if we look at what a chief revenue officer does, are they getting involved themselves in the minutiae of what's going on? In large organizations, no. In smaller organizations, yes, of course they are, because they still have to carry on doing some of those things. So I do think that the CISO is on that similar track. And for some, that will be really exciting. For others, it won't be, because they just like doing what they're very good at.
Right.
And, they would rather hand that off then to somebody else in the business. But what I think it does do, and this is a really important point, given the skill shortage, is it opens up the CISO role to people who might want to come into it from different functions. So you don't have to have X number of years, in a security function or in an IT function in order to be an effective CISO. You need to have very finely developed interpersonal skills. You need to have very finely developed business skills, and you need to be able to manage effectively the people that you've got in your organization to get the best from them in pursuit of the cyber resilience goals that the organization is charging after.
There seems to be a coming evolution, perhaps, so tell me if I'm right. Security used to be about IT, and then it became about information security. I've heard some people start to discuss the possibility that the future of the security leader is not being a CISO, but being a CSO. Is it being a chief security officer and no longer being siloed even in information, but looking at security across the organization, looking at facilities security, personnel security, sort of a much broader security leadership function?
Well, a number of our members have certainly gone down that road. I can think of some in aviation, I can think of some in telecommunications that have evolved into that role. And so when I look back at why that has happened, why the organization has made that shift, again, it's mainly because data, information, has become relevant in those physical areas. So it has made sense to have physical security being linked in with information security, because information is powering the physical security components. And I think that's why some of them have done that. But interestingly, that raises the question then about what is the route to the CSO? Is it through IT or is it perhaps through facilities? And I go back to what I just said. I think it's more about the more senior executive level skill sets that are required, it doesn't matter so much where you come from.
Right. Let's talk about something that we've discussed a number of times. So you and I come back in podcast after podcast referencing the skills shortage. And there's some more research that I wanted to ask you about. 32% of US and UK-based security leaders are thinking of quitting their current role in the next 6 months. So considering the skills shortage that already exists, that's particularly concerning. There's going to be potentially a 1/3 drop-off of existing security leaders. So maybe we can attribute that to security historically being a very intensive and thankless job. Maybe we can attribute it to coming out of the pandemic where there was, the black swan of black swan events. Is that the reason for this churn, this high-level drop-off? Is there some other reason that 1/3 of our security leaders are getting out of their gig? What's going on?
I think it's a combination of all the things you've talked about, Tavia. I think there's also another piece in there, though, that isn't just specific to security. And, we're seeing a whole section of the population, early to mid-50s, who have decided to exit their industries, whatever that might be, take early retirement, go off, do something different, because the pandemic has caused them to rethink their lives. And some of them being in a very fortunate position of having perhaps, accumulated retirement plans, 401ks, for instance, in the US or retirement plans elsewhere, are able to go off and do something different. And so if we then bring that back to security, yes, you're right, it is a very high pressure environment.
Yeah.
But is it any more high pressure than, say, the head of sales? If we take that as an example, the churn rate in the head of sales is now at something like 18 months. So, are we going to see CISOs churning at that sort of rate? Some may say that it's even less than that in the CISO environment. It's probably running at about 2 years, 2 and a bit years. So I think with any high-pressure job, you're going to see churn. The issue for me, if we would try to solve it, is how do we help people in those roles really focus down on getting the work-life balance right?
Right.
Now, the CISO is always going to be on call. Right. So if there's a breach, it's no good saying, well, actually, I'm having 2 weeks off. See ya.
Yeah.
They're going to have to go in there and sort things out. But it is about how we better equip them to deal with that. It's about how we can make more use of technology, how we can make better use of some of the people that are there, how we can spread the load perhaps across other parts of the organization, as I was saying, in terms of, devolving security out into different business areas. So I think that we have to be smarter in terms of the way that we structure our organizations. And that's really where I come back to what I was saying before, which is I don't believe that the construct we've got today for security in a large number of organizations, not all, but in a large number of organizations, is fit for purpose for the future. And we will change that.
Well, if the average tenure of a CISO is low enough, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years, that they never see a strategic plan through and they're not building the proper relationships through the business and up to the C-suite, then what do you think fundamentally needs to change so that, yes, this work-life balance piece I think is very important. Maybe that is the fundamental thing, or maybe that in addition to some other components will enable those security leaders to remain in their jobs longer and see those strategic ambitions through. What is the answer, or what are the... Solve it for us today, right here, please.
I don't, again, I'm sure people will disagree with me. I don't think it's that different from any other job. What I mean by that is if you're an HR director or if you're a chief executive and you're seeing churn in a certain part of your business, you need to look into why that's happening. And you need to put in place programs or approaches or whatever it might be to address that. I don't know that we've done that yet with security and with CISOs. I think that we've still got them as being a little bit of a dumping ground for some of the problems that we're talking about.
I think the security leaders would agree with that.
And I think that's a maturity issue as well. But I think, that some of the responsibility lies with the CISO. So you've just said that, we're churning them over 2 years or whatever it is. Well, we still don't have enough CISOs, going into new jobs who are being really specific about what they need from the business that they're joining. If it's access to the board, fine. Get that clear before you sign. If it's a whole pile of technology or support services, or whatever it is, the time to be making these demands, if you like, or setting out your stall as to how you're going to run something is not after you've joined the organization. It's before you've actually signed. So I think that CISOs need to be braver about determining what they want from the next step in their career, what they need from the organization in terms of support in order to deliver on that. And frankly, if they're not going to get it, then they should go and do something else. Because there's no point taking a job and setting yourself up to fail. Now, again, some people may think that's a little bit contentious, but that's what chief operating officers do, heads of sales do, finance directors do, HRDs do. So again, it's about this moving us down this maturity curve, if you like, of where security is, and CISOs or CSOs really understanding that they own responsibility for solving some of these problems as well. And the market being the way that it is, they're in a pretty good position. Because if they're not going to get what they need to do the job, there's not really too much of a shortage out there in terms of opportunity.
Yeah. Let me push back a little bit, though, because at some point, someone is going to have their first CISO job.
Sure.
So for somebody who wants to do their best and come in as prepared as possible, but they've worked up, but this is the first time they have that responsibility, what advice do you have for an ambitious new CISO who has experienced everything but this position, and they need to have these specific asks, they need to have a strong voice, they need to have that boldness? How do you grow those soft skills and that kind of backbone in your first CISO job?
I think if we look at it and compare it with other senior positions, the question is the same. How do you develop into being a chief operating officer? Well, you probably have a training and development program that you'll have put together that you'll be implementing over a period of time. You will probably, sometimes with the support of your organization, sometimes not, have some kind of coach and mentor support network that you've established. And at the ISF, we're talking quite a lot now about how we can put in place some of those sorts of support programs.
Right.
Because we do have former members who are moving into early retirement that don't want to stop working, but don't want to work full time.
Right.
So what can they do? How can they support some of these newer evolving roles that may or may not be called CISO actually in the future, but do the CISO job?
I think whenever we talk about voice, I'm always particularly interested, and I know that podcast listeners will recognize that because that's my life, the voice. And I think that physically having a strong voice is empowerment at its most essential. Do you, as a leader, think about your voice, the way you use your voice, your tones, your pace, your rhythm? And when you're leading, is that something that is a superpower for you? Your physicalization of your voice, more than just your voice in your communication style. I'm not talking about that like on paper, but your physical voice. Do you have any experience with that awareness?
I think that the longer you do the job, the more aware you become and the less you have to work at it because it becomes more natural because you've been doing it for so much longer. I think that you always have to be aware of, perhaps it's not just voice, but it's more about physical presence, energy, call it what you will.
Yeah.
That as you move up an organization, you do, assume a slightly different role and people will perceive you in a different way. And you have to be aware of that. And it can be a very powerful tool and it also can be a very destructive tool.
Right.
So I think that there is a need for people, yes, to understand how they are using that so that you use it positively. And by that, I mean, you understand the impact that whatever you say, how you behave is going to have. And it should always be in pursuit of the goal that you've set from that particular interaction. And that can be a variety of different things. It can be about getting the job done. Okay, you might behave in a certain way. It might be about trying to encourage younger people within the organization, for instance, to explore. Mm-hmm. I often say at the ISF that I still don't think that we fail often enough, which means that we're probably not trying new things often enough. We're not being agile enough. We're not breaking boundaries. I think that you have to always, in everything that you do these days, become much more entrepreneurial. You shouldn't be afraid to make a mistake. So, I try to create an environment, particularly at the ISF, where you're not afraid to make a mistake. We all do it. Mm-hmm. And that's how you learn, and then you develop and you go from there again. And so I think that requires a slightly different tone of voice, if you like, from perhaps talking to salespeople who are missing quota or who don't know how to achieve quota, because then, again, you're taking on different kinds of roles. So it doesn't matter what function you have. Of course, you always have to manage the way in which you interact with people. And it does require a degree of self-awareness. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something to a certain extent that you can train. But for me, it's all about having the right mentors and coaches and having the right level of transparency and feedback. And, I've spent a lot of time looking in my career at I've found it very helpful to compare what you do in business with what different sports teams do. That happens to be what works for me. Mm-hmm. For other people, it would be something totally different. And I don't think it matters what it is. I think as long as you're constantly looking at how you can get the best from your people and from yourself, then that's the right way to go. And CISOs are no different. Mm-hmm. They have to be doing exactly the same thing.
Do you think that there's a role for qualities like empathy, playfulness, even compassion, or, certainly creativity, but these other characteristics? Is that part of the tool set of the future security leader?
I think they're essential components. You're not going to be able to work across the different generations that you will always have, in your department or your organization, unless you've got those skill sets. Because without them, you're bound to miss opportunities to grow people, opportunities to support them when they need it, and that is really the fundamental, I think, of good management. And I think that becomes then, because it isn't all about being soft and fluffy, that becomes the differentiator. Yeah. So in an environment where skills are short, then who would you rather work for? Somebody that displays some of those characteristics that you've just been talking about, or go down the road to a sweatshop where you're really not valued. Right. I think it may sound like a stark comparison, but I think that's the reality for a lot of people.
Do you think empathy is something that people can learn, or is that inherent, you've got it or you don't?
No, I think you can always learn things. It's whether or not you're able to achieve mastery. I think you need to have a little bit of it in you to start with, but it doesn't mean to say that you can't build it over a period of time.
Yeah. Well, that's encouraging. I think about that question a lot these days. One or maybe two final questions. Is there a role for AI that is greater than just automating some functions? In the future, is artificial intelligence going to be a major component of the security landscape, or is it going to be a small and sort of technological process, sort of running things off on the side?
I think that AI will be a significant proportion of every component of every organization. And so I don't think security is any different. So if you think about what I've said about security moving out of the silo into mainstream business, then AI has to be part of that conversion, part of that overall plan. Now, the speed at which that happens will depend on the stage of evolution of your organization, size of the organization, access to funds and so on that you have within the organization. But it won't be too far into the future where even small businesses are outsourcing their AI requirements to run certain components of the enterprise. And then we get back into some of the traditional security issues like, third-party management and supplier security and all of those sorts of things. So the core components of security will remain irrespective of what we actually do. But as far as AI is concerned, it will be integral in every business.
What are you most looking forward to? What excites you or makes you feel the most curious or hopeful or interested about the future of your business and of security overall?
Well, I think that, very often when people talk about security, and it's becoming less so, They used to imagine it being a very sort of dull and dusty and dry sort of topic,
Right.
And it isn't. It is exceptionally fast moving.
Yeah.
You always are learning something. And I think if you like that kind of change, and not everybody does, but if you like that kind of change, then it's a good place to be. I think it's also intellectually stressing and stimulating because you're always having to look at different ways of solving particular problems. And, if you're the sort of person that likes a challenge on a daily basis, then security is probably a good place to work because, challenges are thrown at you on a very regular basis day to day. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. I mean, I'm not the kind of person that likes static environments.
Right.
I do like change. I like transformation. But I also know that for some people, that's not what they want to do when they come to work on a daily basis. And so again, within any organization, you need to make sure that you're taking everybody along with you. And security is no different in that, because I think that so many of the changes we've just touched on, things like AI or perhaps becoming part of having responsibility for more physical as well as information security, those are all very significant changes. And you want to try to make sure that your core team and the people that you're trying to retain within your business, attract into your business, understand the role that they can play in that, and that they're equally fired up and excited about the opportunity, whatever that looks like, and for however long they happen to stay with you.
Yeah. We've been together for quite a number of years, and it's very cool to be on set with you. Thanks for inviting me to your inner sanctum of videos at ISF. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you're burning to talk about that I've left on the table that we should touch on before we wrap up?
No.
Nothing at all?
Nothing at all.
We've covered everything.
We've covered it all. We're all set. No, we've done it for this particular session. I mean, I'm sure that, as with everything, we'll keep coming back to some of the themes that we've touched on. They constantly evolve. They constantly change. And, if I look forward to the program that we've got, that we're rolling out in 2023, we're going to be revisiting a whole range of different areas that, relate to people, that relate to technology. And we'll be putting together, I'm sure, a pretty rich program that people will be listening to on a regular basis.
I expect so. I look forward to it. All right. Thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you, Tavia.
We'll be back with a new episode in a week. In the meantime, as always, we ask that you take 10 seconds to pull up this podcast on whatever device you're listening and give us a 5-star rating. If you have a little more time, you can even write a quick review. That helps other listeners who might enjoy our content find us. And we also want to make sure to introduce you to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research is uniquely applied to their real-world context. We hope you'll listen, and of course, we'll put a link to that show in our show notes. If there's a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak, senior producer Katie Flood, mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Thanks for listening.